Is it time to tame the high seas from bloodthirsty scoundrels and pirates? Actually, the concern for the wilds of the high seas is to protect sea life from the effects of humanity, such as unsustainable fishing activities, harmful pollution from toxic chemicals and plastic waste, and future deep-sea mining for rare resources that are difficult to find on land masses. In this week's Ethical Dilemma in Science, we will look at some of the important points of the High Seas Treaty and the Global 30 by 30 Conservation Initiative, learn how the United States ratifies treaties, and consider if the United States should adopt the High Seas Treaty. In order to understand what regions of the ocean are affected by the High Seas Treaty, it's necessary to understand how the waters around a nation are going to be regulated and protected. So as a starting point, there's going to be a baseline that is established at the low water line along the coast of a nation state as it's indicated on large-scale maps. Everything on the landward side, so basically on the land side of this baseline value, are going to be referred to as internal waters. And the state has total sovereignty over these internal waters as if they were the equivalent of land territory. Now, extending from the baseline value up to 12 nautical miles is going to be the territorial seas. This is a region that the state can claim sovereignty over, and so they have control over the water, the airspace above, the seabed below, as well as the subsoil, but they don't have exclusive rights to this. Foreign ships still have the right of innocent passage and can move through the territorial seas. Beyond the territorial seas are going to be the contiguous zone. The contiguous zone goes beyond the territorial sea, continuing out towards the ocean for up to 24 nautical miles from that baseline. And in these regions, the nation state can control this region to prevent infringement of customs, fiscal, immigration, and sanitary laws. They can also regulate the removal of archaeological and historical objects found on the seabed within this region. Now, in addition to the contiguous zone, we're going to have the exclusive economic zone. Now, the exclusive economic zone can extend up to 200 nautical miles from that baseline. And in this region, the nation state has sovereign rights to the natural resources, both living and non-living, within the ocean, on the seabed, and even into the sea soil, the subsoil. And so a state can determine if they're going to protect and preserve the marine environment or conduct marine research within these regions. Now, beyond that 200 nautical mile mark are going to be the high seas. So basically beyond that exclusive economic zone. But what happens in these regions of the ocean close to a nation's boundary that are going to be controlled and regulated by that nation, but it's not isolated. It's not separate from the rest of the ocean. If we take a look at the global level of ocean currents, we see that there are ocean waters that are driven by differences in temperature and salt levels. And an example of that is the Gulf Stream that is located within the Atlantic Ocean, starting out within the Gulf of Mexico and then extending across the Atlantic Ocean all the way up past northern Europe. This is basically carrying warmer water, which will contribute to warmer and milder weather in the Western European countries. And now, if we've got warmer water flowing north, we're going to have cold water that is going to flow deep within the ocean from the polar regions back down towards the equator. And so the presence of the Gulf Stream, the presence of these ocean currents, means that we are able to affect the climate within Europe such that kind of the warmer environments in the southern United States are paralleled by these warmer temperatures and warmer climate in the European regions at a much higher latitude. They're much further north, but they're still having those mild temperatures as a result of the Gulf Stream. These ocean currents will result in the movement of materials from a region protected by a nation into the high seas and ultimately into other regions protected by other nation states. We can see the same thing occurring with marine life. And so the results of satellite tracking, where they basically use small transmitters to report the location of the marine animal, they've been able to demonstrate, in this slide we're looking at sea turtles on the left and whales on the right, we've been able to see that many marine species spend significant portions of their lives in international waters beyond the protections provided by individual nations. Now, man-made dangers to the sea creatures in the high seas would include entanglement in fishing gear, plastic pollution, and collision with ships. At the 2022 UN Biodiversity Conference, COP15, they established a goal to reverse the destruction of nature by protecting 30% of the planet's land and 30% of the planet's water by 2030. The oceans are important as half of the world's oxygen comes from phytoplankton, basically small microorganisms that are capable of doing photosynthesis within the oceans. They are able to produce up to 50% of the world's oxygen. And the high seas is estimated to absorb up to 30% of carbon emissions. As of 2023, roughly 16% of the land and inland waters and only 8% of marine areas are protected. Human activities such as farming, resource extraction, and settlement have degraded the Earth's ecosystems and threatened vulnerable species of plants and animals with extinction. Currently, marine protected areas exist in exclusive economic zones, but only cover about 3% of the high seas. Now, President Biden signed an executive order in 2021 establishing a national goal to conserve 30% of U.S. lands and fresh water and 30% of U.S. ocean area by 2030. Based on a 2021 national survey, 4 out of 5 U.S. voters were in favor of this initiative. A preliminary report titled Conserving and Restoring America the Beautiful outlines a decade-long national conservation effort and identifies 8 core principles to achieve the 30 by 30 goals. In the United States, currently about 13% of the land is protected. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea on the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Marine Biological Diversity of Areas Beyond National Jurisdictions, it's quite a mouthful, but it's otherwise known as the High Seas Treaty. This was adopted in June of 2023. Now, the high seas represent about 95% of the world's total habitat by volume and are relatively unexplored. In effect, the High Seas Treaty would result in the creation of international parks that are roughly similar to the national parks such as Yellowstone. As of September 2023, 70 nations had signed on to that treaty, but the treaty will not go into effect until it is ratified by at least 60 nations. This treaty is the first coordinated effort to protect marine biodiversity on the high seas and is a crucial step at achieving the goal of conserving and protecting at least 30% of the ocean by 2030 as part of the Global 3030 initiative. This treaty also provides legal framework to promote stewardship and sustainability in the high seas beyond these national boundaries, covering upwards to 2/3 of the planet's oceans. Now, there are 75 different articles within the treaty that provide specific initiatives for protecting and ensuring responsible use of the marine environment, maintaining the marine ecosystems, and protecting marine biodiversity. Included within the treaty are recognition of the rights and traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples, freedom of scientific research, and promotion of fair and sustainable sharing of the resources and benefits of the ocean. When ratified, this treaty requires working groups and meetings of the Conference of the Parties to create and implement specific actions to achieve these articles. The United States signed the High Seas Treaty Agreement in September 2023, but it's not ratified at this point. In order to be ratified, so basically officially bring the United States into the High Seas Treaty, the President sends the treaty to the Senate, where it is reviewed and considered by the Foreign Relations Committee. The Foreign Relations Committee will then report the treaty back to the Senate with a recommendation of favorable, a recommendation of unfavorable, or it may return it with no recommendation, or it can choose to decline to act, and it basically sits there without moving forward. In an executive session, the Senate will consider a resolution of ratification that must be passed with a 2/3 majority of the senators present and voting to provide the Senate's advice and consent. allowing the president to proceed with ratification of the theory. Once ratified, the treaty becomes a part of the domestic law. The adoption of the UN's High Seas Treaty was a major advance for conservation in the world. But it still has critics, as we're looking at basically applying rules to regions of the planet that didn't have rules to start with. One concern is what regions of the ocean are going to be protected. It's not identified within the High Seas Treaty, but the framework is established for how we're going to protect various regions of the ocean. It's going to be determined by a committee that reviews scientific environmental studies, and the committee has to make their judgment based on a majority rather than a consensus, so that a single party cannot prevent the process. Now, critics argue differently that the treaty could limit access to resources like fish, oil and gas reserves, minerals that are abundantly found in these international waters. And this could have an impact on the global economy. Now, if we take a look at this economic impact, there's a lot of concern of developing nations. Developing countries want a share of the resources from protecting these areas, such as technology or potential genes that are discovered or developed from the high seas. In response, developed nations have responded that the companies taking up this work need to be able to have a reasonable return for their investment in order to be incentivized to conduct the research. Developing countries are also concerned that they're going to be limited in what they can do with the rules under the High Seas Treaties because they weren't the ones that caused this marine biodiversity crisis. And they feel that they shouldn't be prevented from accessing the resources within these areas after developed nations have already benefited from their exploitation in the past. So this brings us to our ethical dilemma in science for this week. Should the United States ratify the High Seas Treaty? How do you balance the need for resource harvesting with conservation efforts and a free and fair access to those resources for all nations? Should all or some of the principles of the High Seas Treaty be extended to territorial waters? And then finally, what can be done to promote these principles with countries that do not ratify the treaty? Thank you for listening to this week's Ethical Dilemma in Science. As always, please see the description below for additional information and references. Thank you, and have a great week.